Hello and welcome to IMTV, the YouTube channel and video channel of the International Marxist Tendency. The International Marxist Tendency, for those who don't know, is an international revolutionary organisation fighting in the class struggles and revolutionary movements taking place across the world right now. We have sections in around 40 different countries. And if you're interested in finding out more about getting involved, then I recommend heading to our website, marxist.com, getting in touch with us there. And tonight we're going to be joined by Paul Murphy, who is a TD, that's an MP in Ireland. And Paul represents voters in Dublin South West in the Irish Dáil, the Irish Parliament. And he's with the party Rise, part of the Solidarity People for Profit coalition. And tonight Paul's going to be talking to us about the situation in Ireland right now and how the coronavirus crisis is impacting on Ireland. So without further ado, let me try and bring in Paul. Hello, Paul. Can you hear us all right there?
I can. Thanks a lot for having me on.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us tonight. So just to get going, obviously across the world, we've seen the coronavirus crisis having enormous impact on people's lives. And the bosses, the capitalists in particular, seem to be trying to take advantage of this situation to basically carry on making profits and put the burden onto workers. And I know that you and your party have been very active in campaigning against some of these kind of scandalous actions and behaviours of the bosses. Could you tell our viewers a bit more about some of the campaigns that you've been running and the issues that have been coming up?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably an international phenomenon that everywhere, working class people, particularly those in the health services, but all those who are running essential industries, people in retail, people in transport, logistics, etc. The setting up of community support with basically bosses. This is before you had any sort of shutting down non-essential work, etc. But you could see there was a beginning of real understandable fear amongst lots of people. And then there was quite disgusting profiteering, price gouging going on by pharmacists, by suppliers, by shops, where the prices of things like face masks, hand sanitizer, went up by 300, 400, 500% effectively overnight in an opportunity, just an attempt to maximize short-term profit. So, I mean, our demand there was very clear. We kind of publicized this online, had a social media campaign around it, produced a report outlining what had happened, and had a very simple demand on the government to introduce price controls, which they have the power to do, to say that, well, first of all, we should direct production, and workers should be directing production, that, say, personal protective equipment should be going to the health workers above all. But where you have leftovers that are distributed through shops, they should be subject to price controls. The government didn't do that, I think. I mean, the campaign probably had some effect on embarrassing some of the shops and pharmacists and stuff. But still, we're getting stories coming in of this kind of thing going on, and the government has generally ignored the call for price controls because they don't want to interfere with the market. I mean, the other day, the health minister said there's a special place in hell for people who engage in price gouging, but they refuse to make it illegal. So there's no place in prison, there's no fines for people who engage in price gouging. Maybe it's purely something people will pay for after their death. The second issue, and probably a more important issue that has come to the fore in the last number of days, is, I mean, we've been calling really since the start of the crisis for all non-essential work to shut down. It was very obvious from the start that was what was necessary to slow the spread of the virus. And that's obviously a decision that the government was very slow to make. They represent the interests of the capitalists who want to keep production and the whole cycle of capitalism going, as opposed to bringing that to a halt in order to save lives. So we had a big campaign around that. Um, Eventually, then last Friday, the government took the decision to shut non-essential work under pressure. That was welcome. But even then, you had many companies, and it's still going on, but many companies attempting to suggest that they're essential when they clearly weren't. Um, and so you had us together with Unite, the union, having a campaign of workers and online with social media, kind of highlighting these. And it was interesting. The relatively short space of time, we were able to have small important victories, where the car testing centres on Saturday morning said they were going to be opening again on Sunday. We launched a campaign. Government came under pressure. Within 4 or 5 hours, they'd announced that they wouldn't be reopening. And then BAM, which is a very major construction contractor, I presume they operate in Britain as well. I think they do. They're doing the biggest construction site in Ireland, which is on a National Children's Hospital. They're involved in lots of other construction work. They had been suggesting they were going to close. Then it became clear that they were going to stay open. And we worked with the construction branch of Unite to kind of highlight what was happening around it, to bring pressure to bear on them, to ask the government to use the power that they now have to direct BAM to close. And then eventually, after pressure, thankfully, they did close. We were being contacted by huge numbers of workers and their families, who are afraid that these workers are going into places where it's not possible to physically or socially distance, where you're touching the same stuff as other workers, where it's clearly not essential work, and then you're potentially bringing it back home. And the other example I just gave, which isn't definitely of rise, but of workers, is an important example of workers taking action, because we think this is what's necessary if the companies don't agree to shut down, or to provide appropriate personal protective equipment. This is 2 weeks ago, postal workers in one kind of branch of the postal service had been demanding hand sanitizer, because they're touching letterboxes, letters, etc. So they need to have hand sanitizer to clean their hands as they go. Company had refused to, or had failed to provide it. They said they were going to sort it, but they didn't. And then the workers refused to go out whenever it just didn't arrive, with the result being then that the company came with the hand sanitizer the following working day. And so they got it, and they were able to deliver the post. And it's an example of how workers, in fighting for their own safety, are also fighting for the public's safety and public health at large.
Excellent. Thank you for outlining some of those measures. And you touched a bit upon what the government is doing in terms of their response to the coronavirus. Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, who they veer wildly in one direction and then another when it comes to addressing the crisis. By comparison, Leo Varadkar, the Prime Minister in Ireland, has seemed quite statesman-like, if you like, and has presented himself in a very kind of Churchillian image. And a lot of people are giving him praise for, the kind of serious way in which he's addressed the crisis. Can you elaborate a bit on that? Is that kind of praise earned? Has the government actually responded effectively and and in an appropriate way? Is he really the great statesman that he's made out to be?
No, he's definitely not. Well, I mean, many of the great statesmen of the world were butchers, so maybe it isn't necessarily a good thing to be. But I mean, look, there was a funny article. There's a satirical website called Waterford Whispers, which is like the Irish equivalent of The Onion, the US satirical website. And they had an article the other day saying Ireland declared socialist republic. And it captures some of the sense in which they have done in the last 3 weeks things that they said were just impossible, things that they said were unconstitutional and illegal. They've done them. I'll give you an example. Some of the things they've done is they introduced a rent freeze, so saying that rents can't be increased above the level that they were in before. They introduced a ban on evictions. There are two things that the left has been fighting for years. We've had measures. We passed a bill through Parliament, the anti-evictions bill, and then they said, no, it's unconstitutional, you can't bring it in. And then all of a sudden, they can do it. Similarly, we had the standard rate of unemployment benefit in Ireland is €203 a week. But now they've increased it, or they've introduced a new payment, effectively increased it to €350 a week. So they've almost doubled it. There hasn't been, unlike in countries, many like continental European countries, there's never been a scheme whereby if you're laid off, that you get a percentage of your former income. Whereas now they've introduced a scheme whereby effectively allowing companies to temporarily lay people off, but the state will then pay 70% of their wages. Another measure is that, we have a two-tier health service. We have a public health system, which is drastically underfunded, and we have a private health system for those who can afford it. And we have always demanded bring the private hospitals into the public system, establish a single-tier national health service. And they've said, no, it can't be done, et cetera, whereas they have temporarily effectively abolished that two-tier nature of the health system by leasing the private hospitals and by bringing them into the public system. So that they have done a whole series of things that they said they would never do, that they portrayed as being, crazy left-wing ideas. Why have they done it? One, I think, because they know that they are sitting on a health service that has been drastically underfunded by through decades. It was effectively cut brutally in the 80s, and those cuts were never reversed. And it means, so for example, Italy, I think, has 12 hospital beds per 1,000 people in the country. We have 3 beds per 1,000 people. So the health service is even more exposed and precarious than in many other countries. So they know that. Secondly, they came under massive pressure from below to do what's necessary in terms of to slow the spread of the virus. They're a very weak government in reality. They're a caretaker government. They don't have anything near a majority. They just lost the election quite badly. And so they were under pressure to do the things that's necessary to slow the spread of the virus. And then under pressure from below, also under pressure from the bosses to keep the businesses going and so on, they effectively have acted, but in a delayed fashion. So each time we would raise a demand, they kind of concede or partially concede in a certain way, like in a week down the line or whatever. So it is an interesting process that has taken place. But obviously in the way that they've done it, they've set it up for all these things to be temporary. So there's €350 payment, that's a 12-week payment. And then people are meant to get onto the regular dole. The rent freeze, we tried to extend the rent freeze. We had an amendment in the Parliament, which we only lost by 2 votes, to try to extend the rent freeze. But the rent freeze only goes on for 3 months, whereas their restrictions in terms of civil liberties and stuff go on until November. So it's time limited, and like how they've done it with the private hospitals, they're leaving ownership and control ultimately in the hands of the private sector, and basically they will seek to reverse all of these measures. But obviously it is having an impact on consciousness. If to protect public health at a time of global pandemic, you have to take measures that you previously demonized as being crazy socialist left-wing measures. If that's what's necessary at time of pandemic, if it's, they said it's not acceptable, it would be crazy to, discriminate between rich and poor at this time. Well, if it's crazy to discriminate between rich and poor at a time of pandemic, why is it okay to discriminate when it comes to cancer, when it comes to, heart surgery, when it comes to any other measures? So I think it has kind of pushed the debate and opened up a situation for the left and for socialists to say, no, we're not going back to that old system. And in fact, we need to consolidate those gains on a more fundamental basis, which means changing the whole nature of the economy and organizing it for people's needs rather than profit.
Thank you, Paul. And it's very noticeable in the recent election. Talking about these kind of conversations opening up, the last election obviously marked quite a big change in the sense of Sinn Féin suddenly rising up in the polls. Particularly, it seemed on an anti-austerity program, actually pointing out some of these kind of long-term problems that you've just been discussing as well. Now, how can you elaborate a little bit more about how austerity over the years has led to the situation that we're in now in terms of particularly on the healthcare system and the and other public services in relation to fighting the coronavirus crisis?
Yeah, I mean, you have a, relatively speaking, a small state in Ireland, even compared to the European average in terms of percentage of public spending as a percentage of GDP, substantially lower than the average, and that's seen in terms of completely inadequate public services right across the board. The foremost issues in the election, the two big issues, were the housing crisis and the health crisis. So the housing crisis is just horrendous. I mean, that's the biggest kind of constituency issue that I would deal with on a normal, outside of coronavirus, on a normal basis. Every day I'd be contacted by a bunch of people who've become homeless, who often are working in low-paid jobs, sometimes a couple working in a low-paid job, where rents just went through the roof, where rents for like very ordinary has been rising despite all sorts of kind of massaging of the figures by the government. So a massive crisis. And the whole approach to the government has been stick within the framework of neoliberalism, refuse to break from the market, refuse to invest in building public housing, refuse to have proper rent controls, and instead incentivize landlords, give them more profits, incentivize developers in a really craven way that was very blatant for people and enraged people. So that was a key issue in the elections. And the other is the health service, where it's just every aspect of it is massively underfunded. And fundamentally, that's because they have, private hospitals owned by very rich and powerful businessmen. And, your private hospital system and your private health insurance system isn't going to work unless there's a problem with your public health service. The only way anyone's going to pay for private health insurance and to go to private hospitals is if the public health system is inadequate. So the public health system has been underfunded and is completely inadequate. And, every day you have stories of 300, this is outside of the coronavirus, 300, 400, 500 people on hospital trolleys across the country who can't get into hospital beds. So it's horrendous for people. And I think the election, it was interesting because in some ways the general election, like the kind of anti-austerity, anti-establishment mood that was very dominant in 2016 general election, when we were coming off the kind of, that was not far off the high point of the big social movement against the water charges. Like social movements in general dipped since then. A big movement around repeal and abortion rights, which was very, very important and a big victory against the conservative establishment, or against those sections of the conservative establishment that didn't see which way that the wind was blowing and shift position, as most of the main parties did. And you had local elections then in between, which it was bad for Sinn Féin, it was bad for the left, and the left was diminished and pushed back, as was Sinn Féin. But in a way, the general election this year, it was like 2016 re-emerged again in a higher way, where people thought this is our opportunity to attempt to get rid of the traditional establishment parties, and Sinn Féin is the most obvious vehicle to try to do so. I mean, Sinn Féin is not a socialist party, is not an anti-capitalist party, fundamentally accept Parliament kind of anti-establishment, anti-austerity sentiment. And the election had a real dynamic to it. I mean, where they went from being the third party by quite a distance to being the first party narrowly, and where the left, relatively speaking, did well in a context of a squeeze by Sinn Féin, the Greens doing quite well. I mean, so the Solidarity People for Profit, fundamentally made up of the Socialist Party, the Socialist Workers Network, and ourselves, Rise, went from 6 TDs to 5, which was, given the context, quite a good result. And 5 is an important number in terms of having a formal parliamentary group, full speaking rights, etc. in the Dáil. And I think, that it's deepened the crisis for the establishment. I mean, so that the two traditional parties of capitalism in Ireland are Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. They're both traditional centre-right conservative parties. They've been on, long-term secular decline since then, for a long time, decades and decades, since probably high point was late 70s, early 80s. They've been on a downward slope since then, but that was then dramatically accelerated by the economic crisis. That destroyed Fianna Fáil. They're almost wiped out. Then Labour was taken out because they went into government. Then Fine Gael paid the price. And so it's been accelerated, and that acceleration was kind of kept going to a point where Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael combined now in the last election got less than 45%. And the result is that, like in the last government, it was Fine Gael in government with a supply and confidence arrangement with Fianna Fáil, supposedly in opposition, but in reality allowing them to govern. And that was an attempt by them to avoid both being in government, the instability that flows from that. But now after this election, even Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael going into coalition together won't give them a majority. They need other parties to make that up. So it speaks to the real crisis of the traditional party system.
And relating to that question then, Paul, there is I've heard talk of needing to form a national government in Ireland now, between Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, and obviously they want to try and exclude Sinn Féin from such a government. This presumably represents the as you say, the weakness of the traditional two centre-right parties. What is it that they're really afraid of in terms of involving Sinn Féin, however, in such a national government? Because in Britain, there's even Tory commentators saying Labour should join a national government, obviously wanting to try and put some of the blame for this kind of disastrous response to the coronavirus crisis onto Labour, kind of get some of the shit to stick to Labour, not just to Boris Johnson. Why do you think the ruling class, the establishment parties in Ireland are having a different approach and desperately want to keep Sinn Féin out?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are differences within the capitalist class and within their parties on how exactly to deal with this situation. What they fear in terms of Sinn Féin is not so much Sinn Féin itself, but the expectations of workers in Sinn Féin and the instability that will flow from a government. If workers feel that in some sense there's a party representing their interests in government, well then they'll say, okay, well now we want to have, a national health service. We want to break with the free market in terms of housing. We want to have real decisive action on climate change, and the kind of struggle that we will put forward to fight for those things, to say, okay, well now they're in government and they said these things, now fight for them, get on the streets, mobilize, organize inside the unions, etc. They're fearful of that instability. In a way, they're caught between a rock and a hard place, because there's two obvious choices for them. One, they bring Sinn Féin in now and face some element of that now, but attempt to effectively tame Sinn Féin, to bring Sinn Féin in, to have, to fundamentally do to Sinn Féin, or have a similar process to like Fianna Fáil went from being a kind of national populist party in the past to being a very respected party of the establishment, to try and do that with Sinn Féin, to do that now. Or the danger is that, well, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael go in together. It's very obviously a right-wing government. It's very obviously a government that was rejected by actually a majority of people in the elections, but then allowed back in because Labour will go in, or the Greens will go in, or they'll get a bunch of right-wing independent TDs to go in, and then face the potential, which I think is quite likely, that the government that follows could be a government made up of Sinn Féin, maybe the likes of Labour and Social Democrats, and possibly effectively allowed come to power, resting on the external votes of the revolutionary left, which says, okay, we vote for you on this basis, you carry out the program that you have promised, and if you don't, we're going to mobilize people and we won't be voting for you anymore, and the instability that causes. And so that's what they kind of had to weigh up. And it's clear now the majority factions in both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are for keeping Sinn Féin out for now. I think in particular Fine Gael feels like right now, as I think is happening around the world, they've got a boost from their management of the crisis. And I think that isn't even just because Varadkar isn't Trump. I mean, Trump has also got a boost. I think Johnson has got a boost. Even where it is really blatant what they're doing, there is that kind of wartime scenario and that boost. So I think they're feeling at the moment that, no, we want to go back into government. Originally, after the elections, they were saying, we've been defeated. We want to be in opposition. We don't want to be in government. Now it's clear they want to be in government. They want to bring Fianna Fáil in. And what they'll be hoping is that they get a boost from their management of the crisis. I think that's going to prove to be a faint hope. I mean, that's going into the last election. That's the Fine Gael mantra was, we managed the Brexit crisis from the point of view of Ireland really, really well. And during the election, commentators would say on the radio or TV to Fine Gael, ordinary people seem to be talking about health and housing. It doesn't seem to be Brexit. And they'd say, no, Brexit is the big issue in the election. And it clearly wasn't the issue. And I feel that can happen. Also, I mean, Churchill, like the soldiers coming home, will have an expectation about people put their lives on the line, and people will have significant number of people, in particular health workers, will have died potentially, and people precisely will say, no, we're not going back to that old system. And the whole question of who pays for this crisis is going to be posed in a very, very sharp way. So I think it's an illusion for them to think that, but I think that's what they're currently going on, and thinking that they can rebuild their support. Whereas I think the main trend in the medium term from this crisis will likely be, certainly in Ireland, will likely be to the left.
And I mean, that's a good place just for the final question, which actually comes from the audience, where we've got Jorge in Britain is asking about something you raised earlier, which is this idea of what happens when they try and take back all of these concessions that they've made now. Because obviously that analogy with World War II that you talked about is a very good one, a very apt one. From the point of view of obviously, the great statesman, so to speak, the so-called great statesman of Churchill was booted out in 1945 by a Labour government coming in Britain, promising the NHS and welfare state and so forth. Today, obviously, a lot of those gains from the past have been eroded away in Britain and internationally. All of these reforms that were struggled for, and in country after country, you've seen big struggles over, anti-austerity issues. In Ireland, obviously, is no exception to this. The movements around rent in Dublin, around the water charges, the nurses going on strike in the healthcare system. So presumably, there's all these struggles that were already taking place, as well as on top of that, the kind of militancy that we're seeing with workers walking out of construction sites and plants and things like that. So how do you see all of these things feeding together? What's your perspective really for the class struggle in Ireland after this initial kind of patriotic kind of national unity wave has subsided?
Yeah, I think obviously the exact timing and so on is not possible to predict, but I think it's difficult to avoid painting a scenario in the next years when the immediacy of the crisis recedes that isn't of quite intense class battles, because it's not just right. So I think the main attitude of workers will be to keep, we have what we hold. We've won these things. We'll hang on to them. That's right. It's not just that the government will be trying to roll things back the way they were.
Sorry, Paul, we're just losing you a little bit there on the connection. Sorry, Paul, we've lost you a little bit on the connection there. Can you hear us okay?
I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. Do you want to just repeat what you said there? I think we lost you for a second there.
So I think it's not just that workers are going to want to have what they hold and not concede, and the government will try to roll it back. It's actually going to be more intense than that, because there's also going to be a substantial price to pay for the crisis and the measures. I mean, it's there's also similarities with 2007, 2008, and the fact that, I mean, around the world, again, global capitalism has proven to be somewhat flexible in terms of their willingness to take measures which go against their own neoliberal dogma. You can see the helicopter money in the US, etc. So in Ireland, they have to some degree thrown money at the problem. But Leo Varadkar made like a speech to the nation on St. Patrick's Day, and he spoke about the bill being enormous and it may take years to pay. And that bill so far is estimated to be 20 billion euros. I mean, in the context of an economy like Britain, that's not such a big amount of money, but that's a third of the annual budget already. And that's likely to increase even more. And they're going to come and look for that to be paid. I also think that it's very likely out of this crisis, you're going to have banking collapses, you're going to have airline collapses, you're going to have hotel conglomerates collapsing. And the government is going to bail those out, or is going to seek to bail those out again with public money, again in a repeat in a different way of 2007, 2008 crisis. So I think it's going to be, enormous, the attacks coming on the one hand. And I think on the other hand, we'll have, really powerful arguments to make about who was it that made sacrifices to fight the coronavirus. To say, if the measures that were necessary to fight the coronavirus were to some degree to break with the dogma of the free market, well then, and that we had to do what the scientists told us to do, which we agree, well then take, for example, the climate crisis. I mean, let's do what the scientists tell us to do on that, which is simply not possible to do on the basis of production for profit. We have to plan the economy for people's needs. We need to take the key sections of the economy out of private ownership into democratic public ownership, establish workers' control of them. And I think those sort of arguments, while not immediately, capturing majority support, they've much more of a basis for than before. But I think people will draw the comparison with the climate crisis, for example, as well as in terms of housing, in terms of health, etc. So I think the stage is definitely set for deepened instability, deepened class struggle, and more opportunities to try and build a mass force for socialist change.
Thank you very much, Paul. We 100% agree with you. We're trying to build that across the world internationally, and solidarity to yourself and the comrades in Ireland who are fighting for these revolutionary ideas there and internationally. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Good luck to you. Stay safe and healthy. Solidarity.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And thanks again to Paul for joining us. Thanks to everyone at home who's joined us. This has been IMTV. My name's been Adam Booth. I'm the editor of Socialist.net. And just a reminder that this is a live stream podcast going out every Wednesday at 6 p.m. British time, UK time. But you can follow us from across the world if you follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. All of the relevant details are over here. And as I said, IMTV is the channel of the International Marxist Tendency, with sections across the world fighting for revolutionary ideas, fighting for the socialist transformation of society, as Paul outlined just now. And if you'd like to get involved, please do check out the website marxist.com. Click join us there. Get in touch, and we would urge you to get involved in the fight for revolution. Next Wednesday, we'll be discussing with our comrades in the US section of the IMT, Socialist Revolution. And on Friday, this Friday, at around 5 o'clock, we'll have a very special broadcast with one of the world. See you soon.